it not. I think it's been, yeah, about 5 months. My last video was in August. And to make a long story short, I decided to make a career switch, which took some time. And that is why the long hiatus. I am unable to work on any sort of lengthy series for the foreseeable future. So I'm going to stay out of the books for the most part, and do isolated videos that cover specific thoughts or ideas or musings that I have. And I've had quite a bit of time to reflect and develop a clearer understanding of my metaphysic as a perennialist, and specifically as a dharmi, or to use a more Western term, Neoplatonism. Not that I would agree with every aspect of the Neoplatonic philosophy, which I can get into another time, but there is much that I have in common with that philosophical understanding and approach. But with that said, what I want to do in this video is tie a few things together that clarifies my own ontology and my own metaphysical perspective concerning the nature of God, with criticisms I have about the Christian doctrine of the Holy Trinity. And what we'll do is we'll tie together several different strands of thought, some of which I have not previously covered, and I'll also integrate it with something that we have previously covered. Because these concepts can be very difficult, as much as I would have liked to kind of sit here and just kind of go through it spontaneously, I think that would cause too many pauses and could be a little bit awkward. So I think what I'm going to do is read from some journal entries I've been doing, and then I may pause where I think certain sections need to be clarified further. And then, so we'll just do that. So let's just get into it. Let's just start. I finally had a chance to tie some of these notes together recently, and so I'm going to read from several pages worth of notes on this, showing why I sincerely believe that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity doesn't just have apparent problems, but like the title of the video suggests, it really is, the deeper you get into the nature of the argument for the Trinity, it really is impossible, absolutely impossible to defend the doctrine. So in a way that is that really makes any sort of sense. And when I say makes sense, I'm not expecting the argument for the Trinity to be rational or to be rationalistic. I recognize the legitimacy of paradox and the legitimacy of mystery. I know that not everything can or has to be explained on a rational level, but I believe that it is an irrational doctrine. So I'll get into that right now. I start by explaining my understanding, not by critiquing the Trinity itself. as the notes develop, we'll start to get into that. So my understanding of personhood. Persons are instances of the same divinity. Now, technically, I do need to go back and explain one thing already at the outset. And I didn't go back and change this in my notes, but I don't technically believe that we are persons per se. Although we use the word as a condescension to because we have to articulate certain concepts when we speak, and person is a very convenient term. But I don't believe that we are technically persons. I believe that we are aspects of God's supreme person or personhood. We are localized, contracted, individuated instances of God's consciousness, of infinite divine consciousness. So let's move on. Persons are instances of the same divinity, being both, paradoxically, contained by the one, while not limited in their number. We partake of God's essence, but are not the totality of that essence. The one is the essential transcendence of God. The many are contained by and in him or her. And I get into this a little bit further later in the notes about why I'm using the pronouns him and her to describe God. All caused conscious persons are finite instantiations of the divine person. Finite persons are, I don't know why I use the term hologram here. I guess in a sense they are holograms. Finite persons are holograms of the supreme person. Since God is transcendent and infinite, these beings are not composite parts of God. God is indivisible, but infinite replicas, divine replicas of the divine. But we are not merely contained in him, her. God is contained in us. God is immanent in this way. What chiefly distinguishes us from the supremely personal being is the fact that our forms are caused, whereas God is uncaused. The distinction is between the cause and caused beings. God is the original form. Hence, what makes us replicas of that form. So God is in us, even as he, she projects or flashes forth from him or herself, quote unquote, beyond him or herself. The cause of our being is eternal, just as the cause of the Logos and Holy Spirit in Christianity is posited to be an eternal causation. God emanates the forms. He does not produce them from nothing, per the Christian doctrine ex nihilo. They come from within himself. Christians cannot consistently describe their view as panentheism, since they view God and quote-unquote temporally caused beings as constitutive of an absolute binary, i.e., a duality. We'll get into this a little bit more as we go in the notes. So, by limiting, okay, so here's a new argument that I have not previously discussed. By limiting the number of persons that can exist within God, 3, Christians have to distinguish between two kinds of causation: eternal and temporal. However, they do not know how to define the difference, in that they fail to articulate what eternal causation is. So let me stop here. Think about this. The Father, or let's just say God creates the world and all that is in it. He creates all the beings that are in it. And then he eternally causes the Son and the Holy Spirit, per the Christian argument. And the Christian argument is that when God creates the world and everyone and everything in it, that is an instance of temporal causation, whereas the causation of the Son and Holy Spirit within the Trinity is an instance of eternal causation. Now, given that both things are caused by the infinite God, in what sense could we possibly say that the world is temporally caused? Is God somehow subjecting himself to time when he creates the world? This is a problem. This is an issue for Christianity. So I'm going back to my notes again. What is the difference between the cause of the Son and Spirit by the Father and the cause of all of us via the Trinity? How can the three persons be co-equal when two of them are caused by a third? Caused beings, by definition, can never be equal to their cause. Thus, there can only be a single principle of causation. All caused beings are equal to each other, but unequal to their cause. Okay, so now here I get a little more specific about the new argument I'm introducing. The number one represents the cause of all beings, and thus contains them all, even if these plural numbers were to go on indefinitely. So you could have an infinite number of plural numbers, right? That just go on indefinitely. You just keep adding the number one to each plural number. You could go on and on and on and on and on. And the number one would contain whatever number you came up with. The number one represents the cause of all beings and thus contains them all, even if these plural numbers go on indefinitely. Paradoxically, one is both greater and less than all plural numbers. The number one contains all plural numbers, all possible plural numbers, and is thus the greatest number. It is less than these same numbers in the sense that it is only the first in the sequence of numbers. Thus, the one, the supreme person, is the Alpha and Omega. The supreme is the sum of all and their origin. See, if he were merely the sum of all those things, then he would be composite or divisible. So he's more than just the sum of everything he contains. He is their cause as well. Thus, the supreme is not just the sum of all beings, but the precondition of their being, making him her more than the totality of all beings. The one is non-isomorphic. There is a direct correspondence between one and any other plural number, but there is also a non-symmetry in that one is both greater than and less than any other number. Christianity says that only one plural number, 3, can correspond to the oneness of God. So think about this carefully here, what I'm about to say. God is implicitly finite, then, since the one God cannot accommodate any other plural number without losing his unity. The one God, therefore, cannot accommodate true plurality as such, which means that implicitly and logically the Christian argument inexplicably posits that the number 3 is the number 1. Now, I'm not saying that the Christian argument is that the number 3 is literally equal to the number 1. I'm saying that it's implicit in their philosophical approach to defending the doctrine of the Trinity. Okay. There is an absolute equivalency, which is an actual contradiction. One of these days, I'm going to make professional videos, but until then, I'm stuck doing this. And since God cannot accommodate plurality within him or herself, plurality can only be a function of the quote-unquote temporal, which is said to be absolutely separate from God. Oneness exists in one realm, plurality in a separate realm. That is, the 3-1 realm, the Trinity, is absolutely separated from the realm of plural forms. Since there can logically be no consanguinity between God and the realm of forms due to the two constituting an absolute binary, to quote a Christian priest, then by definition there is no logos, qua second divine person, who incarnates to bridge the realms. An absolute binary, assuming it is absolute, cannot be bridged by definition. If it is not absolute, an incarnation of God, in the Christian sense, is superfluous and unnecessary. Also, if the two realms were absolutely separate, they would have two completely independent ontological realities, which means the realm of forms would also be uncaused and thus exist alongside God as a parallel divine reality. Two gods, or polytheism. Finally, it must be noted that for the same reason God cannot integrate plurality within himself, neither can he create an indefinite, open-ended number of persons or forms. Okay, this is another new argument. In other words, if God is limited in terms of the number of persons that exist within himself, per the doctrine of the Trinity, then by definition, then by necessity, the creation, this quote-unquote temporal creation, which they posit as being absolutely separate from God, must also be finite in terms of the number of beings that are in it. It's also finite in terms of its extension in space, for example. And in terms of its duration, its history. So it must be noted that for the same reason God cannot integrate plurality within himself, neither can he create an indefinite, open-ended number of persons or forms. In Christianity, the universe has a finite history and thus a definite, fixed number of beings in it. If we define God such that he is incapable of creating an infinite number of beings, then the notion of plurality itself is only illusory. And all is one, in the sense that the forms do not possess any sort of unique identity. Thus, upon taking, so depending on which direction, in other words, you take their argument, the Christian argument for the doctrine of the Trinity can either reduce to dualism, the absolute binary, or to a monism that admits of no distinctions at all, in which the one cannot admit of distinctions within itself. Thus, upon taking the metaphysical claims of Christianity to their extreme logical conclusion, we find that the nature of its claims force it to oscillate between duality and an extreme form of non-duality, where plurality cannot actually exist. In order for plurality to have meaning in and of itself, it must be capable of being expressed by an infinite sequence of numbers. Otherwise, they would simply be aspects of the number one, which is what Christianity does with the number three in the Trinity. If they were merely aspects of the number one, the one would be composite or divisible rather than infinite. Thus, within Christianity, both God's inner Trinitarian life and the outer world are finite. Eternal causation in the Father is limited to two other persons, and the world is limited to a large, though finite, number of creatures. This very observation shows that it is impossible to establish a duality between God and the world. If they were totally separate, the principles of mortality and immortality, God would be as infinite as the world is finite. But instead, we see that dualism requires God be as finite as the world is finite. Dualism simply introduces two finite realities. For if something can subsist independently and apart from something else, neither thing can occupy the fullness of reality. And this is intrinsically characteristic of finitude. Some Christians claim to be panentheistic. All is quote-unquote in God. But this will not save it from dualism if one is not also willing to say that God is in all. The truth is in a classical pantheism. Unfortunately, pantheism in modern times has come to be thought of as as materialistic or naturalistic, in which the divine is reduced to nature in its physically manifested state. Authentic pantheism distinguishes between God's transcendence, or essence, represented by the sacred masculine principle, and God's immanence in creation, which is the manifestation or incarnation of the sacred feminine, the power or energy of God. Though it does not tend to acknowledge the divine feminine aspect of God, the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition recognizes the distinction between God's essence and uncreated energies. The logoi, or quote-unquote words, of the uncreated energies are the quote-unquote principles constituting the inner life of each and every created being. It would seem then that this tradition does in fact profess that God exists within all. The problem is that the beings themselves are considered intrinsically mortal, which establishes in Christian doctrine the absolute separateness between God and creation. Thus, there is posited a duality within created beings themselves between their outer mortal shells and their inner divine life. However, energy, which is not matter per se, but force, is neither created nor destroyed. It is not mortal per se. It simply changes form. And this phenomenon is what we observe as mortality, a kind of death. But mortality is an illusion. I don't mean that what we call mortality does not exist, only that mortality is not absolute, requiring outside intervention to correct. Quantum physics is beginning to show us that matter itself has no stand-alone existence. Beings are, I'm trying to read my writing here, beings are localized instantiations of uncreated consciousness. The outer world, and all beings within it, is mental. Manifested reality is like wax or sand. All forms have the same substrate as their essence, consciousness and energy, while maintaining their distinctive natures, distinctive appearances, and distinctive identities, made up of experiences, thoughts, memories, aspirations, choices, etc. Interpersonal relations are possible because of consciousness. In Trinitarian theology, the divine persons are known purely by their idioms or properties, i.e., by what differentiates them, such as the property of unoriginateness, the Father, the property of generation or begottenness, the mode of the Son's origin from the Father, or the property of procession or spiration, the mode of the Holy Spirit's origin from the Father. But a positive definition of a person does not exist in Christianity. So how do persons, only known by what differentiates them, let's see, how do persons only known by what differentiates them actually relate interpersonally? And that's where I've ended. I may add some more to it. I think it's going to become an article eventually, and not necessarily in the form in which I read it. Right now, these are just disjointed thoughts and ideas. Although they did have a logic to them, there was a continuity there in the notes themselves, from one thought to the next. But there needs to be more fleshing out and some more maybe definition of terms. But yeah, so that's that. I will come back again. Who knows when? It won't be 5 months though. I'll be making these a little more regularly. So you guys have yourself a nice day, and always feel free to leave comments, ask questions. Let's have some rigorous dialogue. It's been a good while since I've had a good dialogue with someone on. I've been doing a lot of reading on, a lot of reading in philosophy, but I haven't really had the opportunity to get into it with anyone on any of these matters for some time. Yep. So you guys have yourselves a good week, and I'll meet you back here whenever I'm inspired to. All right.